The wind howled across the barren fields like a dying animal, carrying with it the bitter scent of failed dreams and withered crops. Carol Stewart stood at the edge of what had once been a promising wheat field, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from the terrible certainty that everything was lost. The stalks that should have been golden and heavy with grain stood brown and brittle, crackling in the merciless autumn wind like the bones of the dead. Behind her, she could hear the voices of the other women, their words sharp with panic and accusation. They had come as mail-order brides, each carrying their own desperate hopes to this unforgiving corner of Nebraska. But now they spoke only of escape, of the trains that would carry them back to whatever lives they had fled. Carol pressed her palms against her hollow stomach, feeling the gnawing emptiness that had become her constant companion these past weeks. "You're a fool if you stay," Susan Wood called out, her voice cutting through the wind. "Look at this place, Carol. Look at what it's done to us." Carol turned slowly, taking in the sight of the 5 women who had become her unlikely companions in this desolate place. Susan, once plump and rosy-cheeked, now gaunt and hollow-eyed. Evelyn Edwards, whose careful curls had long since given way to lank, unwashed hair. Sandra Harris, whose fine dress was now patched and stained beyond recognition. Janet Jones, the youngest among them, whose bright optimism had curdled into bitter resentment. They had all answered the same advertisement, drawn by promises of marriage and prosperity to men who owned land in the growing territories of the West. What they had found instead was drought, crop failure, and men who grew more desperate and cruel with each passing day. One by one, the other brides had made their choice. They would take what little money remained and flee before winter set in with full force. But Carol could not bring herself to leave, not yet. Not while there was still a chance, however slim, that something could be salvaged from this wasteland. "The train leaves at dawn," Evelyn said, her voice gentler than Susan's but no less urgent. "There's still time to pack your things." Carol shook her head, her gaze returning to the field. "Someone has to stay with the crop." "What crop?" Sandra's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Carol, there is no crop. There's nothing here but dust and broken promises." But Carol had seen something the others had missed, or perhaps something they refused to see. In the far corner of the field, where a small stream still trickled despite the drought, a handful of wheat stalks remained green. It wasn't much, perhaps enough to fill a single sack if the weather held and if someone stayed to tend them. But it was something. It was hope. The story of how Carol Stewart came to stand alone in that dying field began 6 months earlier, when she stepped off the train in Millbrook with nothing but a carpet bag and a letter from a man named Gregory Lee. The letter had been formal but kind, promising a home and a partnership to any woman brave enough to make the journey west. Carol had been brave, or perhaps simply desperate enough to answer. She was not the only one. The advertisement had drawn women from across the eastern states, each carrying their own reasons for leaving behind everything they had known. Susan had fled an abusive husband in Boston. Evelyn had lost her position as a governess when her employer's wife grew suspicious. Sandra had been cast out by her family when a scandal touched her name. Janet, barely 18, had run from an arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age. They had met on the train, these 5 women, drawn together by their shared uncertainty and the knowledge that they were embarking on a journey from which there might be no return. In those first days, traveling across the endless expanse of prairie, they had sustained each other with stories and speculation about the lives that awaited them. "My Gregory writes that he has 200 acres of the finest wheat land in the territory," Carol had shared, reading from his letter for perhaps the dozenth time. "He says the soil is rich and black, and that a woman with a strong back and a willing heart can help build something lasting." The others had similar letters, similar promises. They had arrived in Millbrook on a day when the sky stretched endlessly blue above fields of green wheat that seemed to roll on forever. The town itself was small but bustling, with a main street lined with businesses and the promise of growth. The men who met them at the station seemed solid and reliable, weathered by hard work but not yet broken by it. Gregory Lee had been exactly as Carol had imagined him from his letters. Tall and lean, with steady brown eyes and hands that spoke of honest labor. He had greeted her with a respectful nod and helped her down from the train platform with a gentleness that made her heart flutter. "Miss Stewart," he had said, his voice deep and warm, "I hope the journey wasn't too difficult." "Not at all, Mr. Lee," she had replied. "I'm grateful to be here." He had taken her to see the land that very afternoon, driving her out in a wagon along roads that were little more than tracks through the grass. The wheat fields stretched in every direction, green and healthy under the summer sun. The farmhouse was modest but well built, with a wide porch and windows that let in the light. "It's not much yet," Gregory had said, his voice carrying a note of apology. "But with hard work and God's blessing, it could be something fine." Carol had stood on that porch, looking out over the endless expanse of growing grain, and felt something she had never experienced before. Not just hope, but a sense of belonging. This could be her home. This could be her life. The wedding had been simple, conducted by the circuit preacher who came through Millbrook once a month. All 5 women had married their intended husbands on the same day, in a ceremony that was more practical than romantic, but not without its own quiet dignity. Carol had worn her best dress, a blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and Gregory had presented her with a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked that morning. The early weeks of marriage had been a time of careful discovery. Gregory was a man of few words, but his actions spoke of kindness and consideration. He rose before dawn to tend the animals and work the fields, but he always made sure there was wood for the stove and water for washing. Carol, for her part, threw herself into learning the skills she would need to be a farmer's wife. She had grown up in a city, the daughter of a clerk who had died when she was 16, leaving her to make her own way in the world. The other wives became her teachers and companions. Susan, who had grown up on a farm before her disastrous first marriage, showed her how to tend a vegetable garden and keep chickens. Evelyn, with her refined education, helped her understand the business side of farming. Sandra, who had once managed her family's large household, taught her the art of making much from little. But it was Janet, the youngest and seemingly most fragile of them, who taught Carol the most important lessons of all. One evening, as they sat together mending clothes by lamplight, Janet had spoken of her fears. "What if we can't do this?" she had whispered, her needle trembling in her hands. "What if we're not strong enough for this life?" Carol had looked up from her own sewing, seeing the fear that she recognized in her own heart reflected in the younger woman's eyes. "Then we'll learn to be stronger," she had said, surprised by the conviction in her own voice. "We'll learn because we have to." Those words had proven prophetic as the summer wore on and the first signs of trouble began to appear. The rains that should have come in July stayed away. The wheat that had looked so promising in June began to show the stress of drought. The men worked longer hours, their faces growing grim as they watched the sky for clouds that never came. By August, it was clear that the harvest would be poor. The wheat that had promised abundance now stood thin and struggling, the kernels small and sparse. The men began to speak in hushed tones of debt and mortgages, of creditors who would not be patient much longer. The women felt the change like a shift in the wind. Their husbands, who had been kind and hopeful in the early days of marriage, became withdrawn and short-tempered. Gregory, who had never raised his voice to Carol, began to snap at small mistakes and retreat into long silences that felt more isolating than any harsh words. It was during this time that the first bride left. Sandra had married Douglas Smith, the youngest of the men and the one with the grandest dreams. But dreams, Carol learned, could become a burden when reality proved harsher than hope. Douglas had borrowed heavily to expand his holdings, convinced that the good times would continue. When the drought hit, he found himself facing ruin. The night Sandra left, she came to say goodbye to the other women. Her face was pale but determined, her few belongings packed in the same carpet bag she had carried west. "I can't stay," she said simply. "Douglas is talking about selling everything, maybe heading to California to try again. But I can't go through this again. I can't keep running from one dream to another, only to watch them die." Carol had wanted to argue, to convince her friend to stay and fight, but she could see the exhaustion in Sandra's eyes. The frontier had asked more of her than she had to give, and there was no shame in admitting defeat. The harvest, when it finally came in September, was worse than anyone had feared. The wheat that should have filled dozens of wagons barely filled 3. Gregory came home that first night of harvest with dust in his hair and defeat in his eyes. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, and for the first time since their wedding day, Carol saw him cry. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice broken. "I'm so sorry, Carol. I brought you here for nothing. I promised you a home, a life, and all I've given you is failure." Carol had moved to stand behind him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "You gave me a chance," she said softly. "You gave me hope. That's not nothing, Gregory. That's everything." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she truly believed them. The pantry was nearly empty, the root cellar bare except for a few withered vegetables. Winter was coming, and they had no money to buy supplies, no credit left with the merchants in town. It was then that Janet announced she was leaving. Tyler Scott had found work in the railroad yards in Omaha, and they would be moving to the city before the first snow fell. Janet tried to sound optimistic about the change, but Carol could see the relief in her eyes. The departure of two of their number seemed to break something in the remaining women. Susan became increasingly bitter, her conversations filled with complaints about the hardships they faced. Evelyn grew quiet and withdrawn, spending long hours staring out at the dying fields with an expression of profound sadness. Carol found herself caught between her loyalty to her friends and her growing determination to see the situation through to whatever end awaited them. She began to spend more time alone, walking the boundaries of Gregory's land and studying every inch of soil and struggling plant. It was during one of these solitary walks that she made her discovery. In the far corner of the property, where a small creek still carried a trickle of water despite the drought, she found something that made her heart race with possibility. A section of wheat, perhaps an acre in total, that had somehow survived the worst of the dry weather. The stalks were shorter than they should have been, and the heads were smaller, but they were green and alive and showing signs of actual grain development. She had run back to the house, her skirts catching on the dry grass in her haste, bursting through the kitchen door with news that she was certain would change everything. "Gregory!" she had called, finding him in the barn mending harness with the mechanical movements of a man who had given up hope. "Gregory, you have to come see." He had followed her reluctantly, his steps heavy with the weight of too many disappointments. But when they reached the cornfield and he saw what she had found, his expression changed, not to joy exactly, but to something Carol recognized as the faintest stirring of possibility. "It's not much," he had said, kneeling to examine the grain heads with gentle fingers. "Maybe enough to fill one wagon if we're lucky." "But it's something," Carol had insisted. "It's a start." Gregory had looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time since the drought had begun to steal their dreams. "It would mean staying through the winter," he said slowly. "It would mean trying to make it on almost nothing until spring. Then that's what we'll do." But even as Carol spoke the words, she knew that not everyone would make the same choice. The very next week, Evelyn announced that she was leaving. Noah Gonzalez had decided to close his failing store and return east, where he had family who could help him start over. "I'm not strong enough for this," Evelyn had confessed to Carol as they sat together for what they both knew would be the last time. "I thought I was, but I'm not. I need comfort and security, and there's none of that here." Carol had held her friend's hands, feeling how thin they had become. "There's no shame in knowing your limits," she had said, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. After Evelyn left, only Carol and Susan remained of the original 5 brides. Susan's husband, Roy Miller, had managed to save some of his cattle, but the lack of good grazing meant he would have to sell most of them at a loss just to buy feed for the winter. Susan spoke increasingly of leaving, of taking what little money they could scrape together and heading back to Boston. The conversations between the 2 remaining women grew strained and difficult. Susan could not understand Carol's determination to stay, and Carol found it increasingly hard to listen to her friend's constant complaints and dire predictions. "You're being stubborn," Susan said one afternoon as they worked together preserving the last of the vegetables from Carol's struggling garden. "You're letting pride blind you to reality." "Maybe," Carol admitted, her knife moving steadily through a pile of carrots that were smaller and more twisted than they should have been. "But what's the alternative? Give up and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been?" The alternative is being practical. The alternative is admitting that some dreams are too big, some places too harsh for people like us. Carol set down her knife and looked directly at her friend. People like us? City people, soft people, people who weren't born to this kind of life. Then maybe it's time we stopped being soft. The argument that followed was their worst yet, filled with harsh words and accusations that neither woman truly meant but could not take back when spoken. They parted that day in anger, and Carol spent the evening alone in her kitchen, wondering if she was indeed being foolish. But in the morning she walked again to the cornfield where the green wheat still grew, and she felt her resolve strengthen. This was her home now, for better or worse. This was the life she had chosen, and she would see it through to whatever end awaited her. The final blow came in early October when Susan made her announcement. She and Roy would be leaving on the morning train, taking what remained of their savings and heading back east before winter made travel impossible. "Come with us," Susan pleaded one last time, her earlier anger replaced by genuine concern for her friend. "Carol, please. Don't stay here alone. Don't throw your life away for a few stalks of wheat." But Carol had made her choice. She stood on the platform the next morning, watching the train carry away the last of her companions, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life, but somehow also more certain of her path than she had been since arriving in Nebraska. Gregory had stood beside her, his face grim with the knowledge of what lay ahead. They were the only couple left now, the only ones foolish or stubborn enough to face the coming winter with empty pantries and failing crops. "Are you sure?" he had asked her as the train disappeared into the distance. "It's not too late to change your mind. I could wire for tickets, and we could be on the next train east." Carol had looked at him, this man who had become her husband and partner in ways she had never expected, and she had seen in his eyes the same mixture of fear and determination that she felt in her own heart. "I'm sure," she had said. "We'll make it work. Somehow, we'll make it work." The weeks that followed were the hardest of Carol's life. With the other women gone, the isolation felt complete and overwhelming. Gregory worked from dawn to dusk, trying to prepare for winter while also tending to the precious acre of surviving wheat. He reinforced the barn, repaired the roof, and chopped wood with a desperate intensity that spoke of his own fears about their chances of survival. Carol threw herself into the work of preservation and preparation with equal fervor. She gathered every edible wild plant she could find, dried them carefully and stored them in jars and sacks. She trapped rabbits and small game, learning skills she had never imagined she would need. She mended and remended their clothes, knowing that new ones would be impossible to afford. But it was the care of the surviving wheat that became her obsession. Every morning and evening, she walked to the corner field to check on the precious stalks. She built small windbreaks from gathered stones and dead branches. She carried buckets of water from the creek when the autumn rains proved insufficient. She stood guard against birds and rodents that would have devoured their only hope for the future. Gregory watched her efforts with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Carol, ma'am," he said one evening as she returned from her latest vigil in the field, "you can't save every stalk. You can't will them to grow through determination alone." "Maybe not," she replied, settling beside him at their simple kitchen table. "But I can try. I can do everything in my power to give them the best chance." He reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her work-roughened skin. "What if it's not enough? What if we lose everything anyway?" Carol looked into his eyes, seeing the fear and exhaustion that he tried so hard to hide from her. "Then at least we'll know we tried. At least we'll know we didn't give up." As October gave way to November, the first hard frost began to threaten the surviving crop. Carol found herself spending entire nights in the field, building small fires to create pockets of warm air around the most vulnerable plants. She wrapped the grain heads in whatever cloth she could spare, creating tiny tents that might protect them from the worst of the cold. Gregory joined her in these nighttime vigils, the two of them working side by side in a silence that spoke of shared purpose and mutual dependence. They had become true partners in a way that went beyond the legal bonds of marriage, united by hardship and sustained by a stubborn refusal to surrender to circumstances that seemed designed to defeat them. It was during one of these long nights that they received an unexpected visitor. Tyler Scott appeared out of the darkness, leading a horse that looked as tired and worn as its rider. Carol's heart leaped with hope that perhaps Janet had returned, but Tyler was alone, his face grim with news that made Carol's blood run cold. "There are men coming," he said without preamble. "Creditors and bank representatives. They're foreclosing on properties throughout the territory, taking the land to settle debts." Gregory's face went pale in the flickering firelight. "When?" "Tomorrow, maybe the day after. They're working their way through the county, farm by farm." Tyler's voice was heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "I came to warn you, but also to ask if you want to come with me. I've got a job waiting in Omaha, and there might be work for both of you." Carol felt the world tilt around her, the careful plans and desperate hopes of the past months suddenly seeming fragile as spiderwebs in a storm. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she found herself looking at the wheat stalks they had worked so hard to protect, and her resolve hardened like steel. "No," she said quietly, "we're staying." Both men turned to look at her, Gregory with surprise and Tyler with something approaching disbelief. "Carol," Gregory said gently, "if the bank takes the land, there won't be anything left to stay for." "Then we'll fight them," she replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We'll show them the wheat, make them understand that there's still value here, still hope." Tyler shook his head sadly. "They don't care about hope, Carol. They care about money, about debts that need to be paid. A few stalks of wheat won't be enough to change their minds." But Carol had moved beyond rational calculation, beyond the careful weighing of odds and possibilities. She had found something in herself during these months of hardship, something she had never known existed. It was not just stubbornness or pride, though those elements were certainly present. It was a deep, unshakable conviction that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. "Maybe not," she said, meeting Tyler's concerned gaze with steady eyes. "But I won't abandon the crop. I won't abandon what we've built here." Tyler left the next morning, his offer of escape rejected, but his warnings taken seriously. Carol and Gregory spent the day preparing for the confrontation they knew was coming, gathering what documentation they had of their efforts and their small successes. But more than that, they spent the time talking, really talking, for perhaps the first time since their marriage began. They spoke of their fears and hopes, of the dreams that had brought them together and the reality that had tested them so severely. "I never expected to love this place," Gregory confessed as they sat together in the kitchen, sharing a simple meal that might be among their last in this house. "When I first came here, it was just land, just an opportunity. But now it's home," Carol finished for him, understanding completely. "Yes, and I never expected to love you either. Not really. I hoped we might grow fond of each other, that we might make a good partnership. But what I feel now—" He paused, struggling with words that seemed inadequate to express the depth of his emotion. "I know," Carol said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I feel it too." They had found love in the most unlikely circumstances, forged in hardship and tempered by shared struggle. It was not the romantic love of novels and songs, but something deeper and more enduring, built on mutual respect and common purpose. The men arrived the next afternoon, a small group of officials in dark suits who looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the struggling farm. Their leader, a thin man with cold eyes and an air of barely concealed impatience, introduced himself as Mr. Harrison from the Territorial Bank. "Mr. Lee," he said without preamble, "I'm here to inform you that this property is being seized to satisfy outstanding debts. You have until tomorrow morning to remove your personal belongings." Gregory stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "Mr. Harrison, I'd like you to see something before you make your final decision." He led the group to the cornfield, where the surviving wheat stood green and promising, despite the approaching winter. Carol walked beside him, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. "This is what we've salvaged from the drought," Gregory explained, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what hung in the balance. "It's not much, but it's proof that the land can still produce, that there's still value here." Mr. Harrison examined the wheat with the dispassionate eye of a man who dealt in numbers rather than dreams. How much? He asked curtly. Perhaps enough to fill one wagon, Gregory admitted. But it's a start. With proper management and better weather next year, one wagon. Harrison's laugh was cold and dismissive. Mr. Lee, your debts amount to nearly $3,000. One wagon of wheat, even at the best prices, might bring $50. Do you see the impossibility of your situation? Carol stepped forward, her hands clenched at her sides. Sir, with respect, you're not just looking at wheat. You're looking at proof that this land can recover, that the drought hasn't destroyed everything. Give us one more season, one more chance to prove what this place can do. Harrison turned his cold gaze on her, his expression suggesting that he found her intervention presumptuous. Mrs. Lee, I understand that this situation is difficult for you, but business is business. The bank has obligations to its depositors, responsibilities that go beyond sentiment and hope. Then let us buy time, Carol pressed, her voice growing more urgent. Take the wheat as a down payment, as proof of good faith. Let us work through the winter and spring, and we'll pay what we owe from next year's harvest. And if next year brings another drought, if the crops fail again, Harrison's tone suggested he already knew the answer. Then you'll have lost nothing that you wouldn't lose anyway by taking the land now, Carol replied. But if we succeed, if we prove that this place can thrive, then everyone benefits. For a moment, Harrison seemed to consider her words. Carol held her breath, feeling the weight of everything she and Gregory had worked for hanging in the balance. But then the banker shook his head, his expression returning to its previous coldness. I'm sorry, but the decision has been made. The property will be seized tomorrow morning. He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Carol with something that might have been pity. Mrs. Lee, I suggest you take what you can carry and make arrangements to leave. The frontier is no place for people who can't face reality. As the men walked away, Carol felt something break inside her chest, but it was not her spirit. It was the last vestige of her willingness to accept defeat gracefully, to bow to the wisdom of those who claimed to know better. No, she said, her voice carrying across the empty field with surprising strength. Harrison stopped and turned back, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Excuse me? I said no. Carol walked toward him, her steps steady and sure despite the trembling in her hands. You want this land? You'll have to drag me off it. Mrs. Lee, Harrison's voice carried a warning tone. I would strongly advise against doing anything foolish. The law is clear in these matters. Then let the law come, Carol replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. Let them come and explain to the world why they're destroying the only crop that survived the drought, why they're taking the home of people who've worked themselves to the bone trying to build something lasting. Gregory moved to stand beside his wife, his own resolve strengthened by her courage. She's right, he said quietly. We're not leaving willingly. Harrison's face darkened with anger. Then you'll be removed by force if necessary. The sheriff will be here tomorrow with whatever assistance he requires. So be it, Carol said, her chin raised in defiance. But we won't make it easy. After the officials left, Carol and Gregory spent the evening preparing for what they both knew would likely be their final stand. They moved their most precious possessions into the root cellar, hoping they might be overlooked in the chaos that was sure to come. But most importantly, they spent time in the corner field, tending to the wheat that had become the symbol of their hopes and dreams. Carol knelt among the stalks, her hands gentle on the grain heads that represented so much more than their monetary value. Do you think we're being foolish? She asked Gregory as they worked side by side in the fading light. Probably, he replied with a sad smile. But I'd rather be a fool who fought than a wise man who gave up without trying. That night they made love with a desperate tenderness, knowing it might be their last night in the home they had tried so hard to build together. They spoke in whispers of their love for each other and for the land that had tested them so severely. Whatever happens, Gregory said as they lay together in the darkness, I want you to know that I don't regret any of it. Not the drought, not the hardship, not even what's coming tomorrow. Because it brought me you, and it showed me what I'm capable of when I have something worth fighting for. Carol pressed her face against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and drawing strength from his presence. Promise me something, she whispered. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens tomorrow, we won't let them make us ashamed of what we tried to do here. Promise me we'll remember that we chose to fight, that we chose to believe in something better. I promise, he said, his arms tightening around her. I promise. Dawn came gray and cold, with a bitter wind that seemed to carry the promise of winter's full fury. Carol rose early and prepared what she knew would be their last breakfast in the kitchen where she had learned to be a farmer's wife. She cooked eggs from their few remaining chickens and baked bread from the last of their flour, determined that they would face whatever came with dignity and strength. Gregory joined her as the sun climbed higher, his face grim but resolved. They ate in companionable silence, both understanding that words were inadequate to express what they were feeling. Outside, they could hear the approach of horses and wagons, the sound growing louder as the sheriff's party drew near. "Are you ready?" Gregory asked as the sound stopped outside their door. Carol looked around the kitchen one last time, taking in the simple furnishings and modest comforts that had become so precious to her. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I'm ready." The knock on the door when it came was firm but not aggressive. Sheriff Williams was a man Carol had met several times in town, a decent man who took no pleasure in the duty that brought him to their door. "Mr. and Mrs. Lee," he said when Gregory opened the door, "I'm here to execute the foreclosure order. I'm hoping this can be done peacefully." "Sheriff Williams," Gregory replied with careful courtesy, "I respect your position, but we won't be leaving voluntarily." The sheriff's face showed his regret at the situation. "Then I'll have to ask you to step aside while my men remove your belongings. After that, I'm afraid I'll have to place you under arrest if you refuse to leave the property." "We understand," Carol said, stepping up beside her husband. "But before you do anything, I'd like to show you something." She led the sheriff and his men to the cornfield, where the surviving wheat stood in defiant contrast to the devastation that surrounded it. Several of the men removed their hats as they looked at the green stalks, recognizing something sacred in the sight of life persisting against overwhelming odds. "This is what we're fighting for," Carol said, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Not just wheat, but the proof that this land can still give life, that the drought hasn't destroyed everything." Sheriff Williams studied the crop with the eye of a man who understood farming, who knew the value of what he was seeing. "It's not much," he said finally, but his tone was respectful rather than dismissive. "No," Carol agreed, "but it's something. It's hope." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the conflict between his duty and his sympathy for their situation. "Mrs. Lee," he said at last, "I understand what this means to you, but the law is clear. The bank has the legal right to this property." "Then let them take it," Carol said, her voice growing stronger. "But they'll have to take it with us on it. We won't abandon the crop." What followed was a standoff that lasted through the morning and into the afternoon. Carol and Gregory positioned themselves in the wheat field, making it clear that anyone who wanted to remove them would have to do so by force. The sheriff's men, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, waited for orders that seemed slow in coming. Word of the confrontation began to spread, and by midday a small crowd had gathered to witness the drama. Some were neighbors who had managed to hold on to their land despite the drought. Others were townspeople who had heard of the situation and come to see how it would resolve itself. As the day wore on, the mood of the crowd began to shift in favor of the Lees. People who had initially come out of curiosity found themselves moved by the sight of the couple standing guard over their small patch of surviving wheat. Stories began to circulate about their determination, their refusal to abandon their home, and their crop despite impossible odds. It was then that an unexpected voice joined the debate. Roy Miller, Susan's husband, arrived on horseback, his face grim with news that changed everything. "Sheriff," he called out as he dismounted, "I need to speak with you privately." The two men conferred in hushed tones for several minutes, their conversation growing increasingly animated. Finally, the sheriff nodded and turned back to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I've just received word that there's been a development in this situation. It seems that the Territorial Bank has been conducting some of its foreclosure proceedings without proper legal authority." A murmur of surprise and interest ran through the crowd. Carol felt her heart begin to race. hardly daring to hope that this might mean salvation. "What kind of development?" Gregory called out. Sheriff Williams looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "It appears that several of the foreclosure orders, including yours, were issued without proper documentation of the debts in question. There are questions about the legal standing of some of the bank's claims." Mr. Harrison, who'd been standing at the edge of the crowd with his associates, stepped forward with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Sheriff, I must protest. These are desperate attempts to delay the inevitable. The bank's position is legally sound." "Maybe so," the sheriff replied, "but until the territorial court can review the documentation, I can't proceed with the eviction. The foreclosure is suspended pending investigation." Carol felt her knees go weak with relief, and only Gregory's strong arm around her waist kept her upright. They had won a reprieve, perhaps nothing more than that, but it was enough to keep fighting. The legal reprieve gave Carol and Gregory time to strengthen their position, but it also brought new challenges and responsibilities. Word of their stand had spread throughout the territory, inspiring other struggling farmers to resist foreclosure and fight for their land. Suddenly, their small farm became a symbol of resistance against the forces that seemed determined to drive settlers from the frontier. Visitors began arriving daily, some offering support and assistance, others seeking advice or simply wanting to see the couple who had defied the bank and won. Carol found herself thrust into a role she had never sought, becoming a spokesperson for farmers' rights and frontier resilience. The wheat in the cornfield became almost sacred to these visitors, a living symbol of hope and determination. People came from miles away just to see the green stalks that had survived when everything else had failed. Carol was both honored and overwhelmed by the attention. She had never considered herself a leader or a symbol, but she found herself speaking to groups of farmers and townspeople about the importance of perseverance and the value of fighting for what you believe in. "We didn't set out to be heroes," she told one gathering at the church in Millbrook. "We just refused to give up on something we loved. Sometimes that's all it takes to make a difference." The legal battle dragged on through November and into December, with lawyers and officials arguing over documentation and precedent, while Carol and Gregory continued to tend their precious wheat. The crop had survived the first hard frosts, protected by the careful measures they had taken. But winter was far from over. It was during this time that Carol received an unexpected visitor. Janet Jones, the youngest of the original mail-order brides, appeared at their door one snowy December morning, her face pale with cold and exhaustion. "Janet!" Carol exclaimed, pulling her friend into the warm kitchen and wrapping her in blankets. "What are you doing here? I thought you were in Omaha with Tyler." Janet's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the cup of hot coffee Carol pressed into her hands. "I was," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't stop thinking about you, about what you were doing here. Tyler found work at the railroad yards, and we had a decent room, but it wasn't home," Carol finished gently. "No, it wasn't. And when I heard about your fight with the bank, about how you were standing up for all of us, I knew I had to come back. I knew I had to help." The reunion was emotional for both women. Janet had grown thinner during her time in the city, but there was a new strength in her eyes, a determination that had been missing when she left. "Tyler thinks I'm crazy," Janet admitted as they sat together by the fire. "He says I'm throwing away our chance at a better life for a hopeless cause." "Maybe we are all a little crazy," Carol replied with a smile. "But sometimes crazy is what it takes to change things." As winter deepened, the small community that had formed around their farm began to take on a life of its own. Susan and Roy Miller had indeed returned, establishing themselves in a small house in Millbrook while they worked to reclaim their own land. But it was the wheat itself that remained the center of everything. Carol continued her daily vigils, protecting the precious stalks from wind and snow and the small animals that would have gladly devoured their only hope for the future. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside their windows, Carol and Gregory hosted a small gathering of the friends and supporters who had chosen to spend the holiday with them, rather than in the comfort of town. The kitchen was crowded with people, the air filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter that had been absent from their home for too long. As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift away to their own homes, Carol found herself standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the snow-covered field where their wheat lay sleeping beneath the winter blanket. "What are you thinking about?" Gregory asked, coming to stand beside her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm thinking about how different this Christmas is from what I imagined when we first came here," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "Thought we'd be celebrating our first successful harvest, planning for expansion and prosperity." "Are you disappointed?" Carol considered the question carefully, thinking about all they had gained and lost over the past months. "No," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm not disappointed. This isn't the life I planned, but it's the life I choose." The new year brought with it a resolution to their legal troubles that was both unexpected and deeply satisfying. The territorial court's investigation into the bank's foreclosure practices had uncovered a pattern of irregularities and questionable documentation that called into question dozens of seizures throughout the region. Mr. Harrison and several of his associates were found to have exceeded their authority in many cases, issuing foreclosure orders without proper legal review. The scandal rocked the territorial banking system and led to new regulations designed to protect homesteaders from predatory practices. For Carol and Gregory, the immediate result was the restoration of their legal claim to their land and the cancellation of most of their outstanding debts. The bank was required to compensate them for the stress and hardship they had endured, though no amount of money could truly repay them for the months of uncertainty and struggle. But more important than the legal victory was what they had discovered about themselves and their community during the crisis. They had learned that they were stronger than they had ever imagined, that they could endure hardships that would have seemed impossible before they faced them. The wheat in the cornfield had survived the winter, its roots growing stronger beneath the frozen soil. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, new green shoots emerged from the earth, promising a harvest that would be modest but meaningful. More visitors came as word of their victory spread, farmers and settlers who were facing their own struggles and looking for inspiration and guidance. Carol found herself becoming something she had never expected to be, a teacher and mentor to other women who were trying to build lives on the frontier. "The secret," she told a group of young brides who had recently arrived in the territory, "is not to let anyone else define what's possible for you. The frontier is hard, harder than anything you can imagine. But it's also full of opportunities for people who are willing to work and fight for what they want." The community that had formed around their farm during the crisis continued to grow and thrive. Susan and Roy Miller successfully reclaimed their land and began rebuilding their cattle operation. Janet and Tyler Scott also returned, deciding that the promise of the frontier was worth more than the security of city life. As summer arrived and the wheat in the cornfield began to show signs of approaching maturity, Carol often found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the train in Millbrook more than a year ago, full of hope but also uncertainty about what lay ahead. That woman had been brave enough to answer an advertisement and travel to an unknown territory to marry a stranger. But she had also been soft in ways that the frontier did not tolerate. The woman she had become understood that the frontier demanded more than good intentions. It required a willingness to adapt and change, to find strength in places you never knew existed, and to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The harvest, when it finally came in late August, was everything they had hoped for and more. The wheat in the cornfield had not only survived, but thrived, producing grain that was of exceptional quality despite the modest quantity. The single wagon that Gregory had predicted became two, then three as other small patches of surviving wheat were discovered and added to their crop. More importantly, the success of their wheat inspired other farmers to experiment with new techniques and approaches that might help their crops survive future droughts and hardships. The cornfield became a testing ground for innovations in farming that would eventually spread throughout the territory. The harvest celebration was attended by hundreds of people from throughout the region, farmers and townspeople, officials, and ordinary citizens who had been touched by the story of the couple who refused to abandon their crop. There were speeches and music, food and dancing, and a sense of community that reminded everyone present of why they had chosen to make their lives on the frontier. As the sun set on that day of celebration, Carol stood once again in the field that had become the symbol of so much more than agricultural success. The wheat had been cut and gathered, the stalks now lying in neat rows waiting to be threshed and prepared for market. Gregory joined her as the last of the celebration wound down, the two of them standing together in the gathering and twilight and looking out over the land that had tested them so severely and ultimately rewarded their faith. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had left with the others?" he asked, his voice quiet in the cooling air. Carol considered the question, thinking about the paths not taken and the lives they might have lived. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I think we would have spent the rest of our lives wondering what might have been if we had stayed." "And now?" "Now I know," she replied, taking his hand and feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and shared struggle. "I know that we chose the harder path, but also the right one. For us, anyway." As they walked back toward the house where friends and neighbors were still gathered around the kitchen table, sharing stories and making plans for the future, Carol reflected on the lessons that the frontier had taught her. She had learned that strength was not about being unbreakable, but about being willing to bend without breaking. She had learned that community was not something you found, but something you built through shared struggle and mutual support. Most importantly, she had learned that home was not a place you discovered, but a place you created through the choices you made and the stand you took when those choices were tested by circumstances beyond your control. The success of their harvest brought new opportunities that Carol had never anticipated. Word of their innovative farming techniques and their successful resistance to foreclosure had reached the territorial capital, and they began receiving visits from government officials and agricultural experts who wanted to learn from their experience. One particularly significant visitor was Dr. Samuel Richardson, the Territorial Agricultural Commissioner, who arrived in early September with a proposal that would change their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. "Mr. and Mrs. Lee," he said, he said as they sat in their marked kitchen. "Your success here has attracted attention at the highest levels of territorial government. We would like to offer you a position as regional agricultural advisors." Carol and Gregor exchanged glances, both surprised by the unexpected offer. They had become accustomed to visitors and attention, but they had never imagined that their struggle to save their farm might lead to official recognition and responsibility. "What would that involve?" Gregory asked carefully. "Travel throughout the territory, working with other farming communities to implement the techniques you've developed here, teaching farmers how to identify and preserve drought-resistant crops, how to organize community support networks." Dr. Richardson's enthusiasm was evident in his voice. "You've proven that smaller farmers can succeed even under the most difficult circumstances, and we want to share that knowledge with others." Carol felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at the proposal. The idea of helping other farmers was appealing, but she was also aware of how much they had invested in their own land and community. "We would need to leave our farm?" she asked. "Not permanently," Dr. Richardson assured her. "The position would involve travel, but you would maintain your base here. In fact, this farm would serve as a demonstration site, a place where other farmers could come to see successful techniques in practice." The offer required careful consideration, and Carol and Gregory spent several days discussing the implications with their friends and neighbors. Susan and Roy Miller offered to help manage their farm during any absences, and Janet expressed enthusiasm for the idea of expanding successful practices throughout the territory. "You've already proven that you can save your own farm," Janet said during one of their evening discussions. "Now you have the chance to help save others. Isn't that what this has all been about? Building something that lasts, something that makes a difference?" They accepted the position, beginning a new phase of their life that would take them far from the cornfield, where their wheat had first survived but would always bring them back to the home they had fought so hard to preserve. Their first assignment took them to a community 3 days ride to the north, where a group of farmers were facing foreclosure proceedings similar to what they had experienced. Carol found herself standing before a group of frightened and desperate people, many of whom reminded her of herself in those dark days when surrender had seemed like the only rational choice. "I know what you're feeling," she told them, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced the same fears and emerged victorious. "I know how impossible it seems, how tempting it is to just give up and walk away. But I also know that you're stronger than you realize, and that together you can accomplish things that seem impossible when you're facing them alone. She taught them the techniques she and Gregory had developed for identifying and preserving drought-resistant crops, for organizing community support networks, for documenting their legal rights and challenging improper foreclosure proceedings. But more than that, she shared with them the most important lesson she had learned, that sometimes the act of refusing to give up was itself a victory, regardless of the ultimate outcome. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking. Not every community they visited was able to save their farms, and not every family was willing to make the sacrifices that success required. Carol learned that her own story of triumph was not easily replicated, that it had depended on a unique combination of circumstances, determination, and luck that could not always be recreated. But even the failures taught valuable lessons, and gradually a network of successful farming communities began to emerge throughout the territory. Farmers who had learned from Carol and Gregory's example began teaching others, creating a spreading web of knowledge and mutual support that strengthened the entire region. The seasons passed, and Carol and Gregory's reputation as agricultural advisors and community organizers continued to grow. They were invited to speak at territorial conventions, to advise government officials on policy matters, and to serve as mediators in disputes between farmers and creditors. But through all of their travels and responsibilities, they always returned to their own farm, to the corner field where their wheat continued to grow and thrive. The original acre had been expanded to encompass nearly 50 acres of various crops, all selected and cultivated using the techniques they had developed during their desperate fight for survival. The farm had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, visited by farmers and officials from throughout the territory and beyond. Carol had established a small school where she taught other women the skills they needed to succeed as frontier wives and partners in agricultural enterprises. The community that had formed around their struggle had also continued to grow and prosper. Millbrook had expanded from a small frontier town to a thriving regional center, with businesses and services that serve farming communities throughout the area. As Carol looked back on the journey that had brought them all to this point, she was struck by how different the outcome had been from anything she could have imagined when she first stepped off the train in Millbrook. She had come seeking a husband and a home, expecting to find security and comfort in a conventional domestic arrangement. Instead, she had found a partnership that went far beyond the traditional bounds of marriage, a love that had been forged in hardship and tested by circumstances that would have destroyed a weaker bond. She had discovered strengths in herself that she never knew existed, and she had learned that true security came not from avoiding challenges, but from developing the skills and relationships necessary to meet them successfully. The 10th anniversary of Carol's arrival in Millbrook was marked by a celebration that drew visitors from throughout the territory and beyond. The event had been organized by the territorial government as a recognition of the contributions that Carol and Gregory had made to agricultural development and community building in the region. The celebration took place in the cornfield where their wheat had first survived, now expanded into a demonstration farm that showcased innovative techniques for drought-resistant agriculture. Speakers included government officials, agricultural experts, and representatives from farming communities that had benefited from the programs that Carol and Gregory had helped to develop. But the most moving moment of the celebration came when the 5 original mail-order brides stood together for the first time since their arrival a decade earlier. Carol, Susan, Evelyn, Sandra, and Janet had all found their place in the frontier community, but their paths had been very different from what any of them had originally expected. "When we first came here," Susan said, addressing the crowd that had gathered to hear their story, "we thought we knew what we were looking for. We thought we were seeking husbands and homes and the security that came with conventional domestic arrangements. What we found instead," Evelyn continued, "was something much more challenging and ultimately much more rewarding. We found that the frontier demanded everything we had to give, but it also offered us opportunities to become people we never imagined we could be." Sandra spoke next, her voice strong and clear despite the emotion of the moment. "We learned that strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up every time you fall and helping others do the same." Janet, now a mother of 3 and a respected educator, added her own perspective. We learned that home isn't a place you find. It's a place you create through the choices you make and the relationships you build. Finally, Carol stepped forward to address the crowd, looking out over the faces of friends and neighbors, colleagues and officials, strangers and family members who had come to celebrate not just their individual success, but the larger story of frontier resilience and community building. 10 years ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the field, I stood in this same spot facing what seemed like certain defeat. The crops had failed, the creditors were demanding payment, and everyone I cared about was leaving for what they hoped would be better opportunities elsewhere. She paused, looking at Gregory, who stood nearby with their own children, born in the years since their struggle had ended in victory. I had a choice to make. I could leave with the others, accepting that some dreams are too big and some places too harsh for people like us. Or I could stay and fight for something I believe in, even when the odds seemed impossible. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word of a story that had become legend throughout the territory. I chose to stay, Carol continued, not because I was braver or stronger than anyone else, but because I couldn't bear the thought of abandoning something I loved without giving it everything I had to give. She gestured toward the thriving fields that surrounded them, toward the community buildings and homes that had grown up around the original farmstead, toward the faces of people who had found their own success and purpose in this place that had once seemed so forbidding. What I learned is that sometimes the act of refusing to give up is itself a victory, regardless of what happens next. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply decide that something is worth fighting for, and then fight for it with everything you have. The celebration continued late into the evening, with music and dancing, food and storytelling that captured the spirit of a community that had been built through shared struggle and mutual support. As the festivities wound down and the visitors began to depart, Carol found herself once again standing in the field where her wheat had first survived, now accompanied by her husband and children and the friends who had become her extended family. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if the wheat hadn't survived that first winter? Gregory asked, echoing a conversation they had had many times over the years. Carol considered the question, thinking about all the paths their lives might have taken if circumstances had been different. I think we would have found another way, she said finally. Maybe not the same way, but another way. Because by then we had already decided that this was where we belonged, that this was worth fighting for. Their eldest daughter, now 8 years old and already showing signs of the determination that had sustained her parents through their early struggles, looked up at Carol with curious eyes. Mama, why did you stay when everyone else left? Carol knelt down to meet her daughter's gaze, thinking about how to explain a decision that had been based as much on instinct and emotion as on rational calculation. Because sometimes, sweetheart, you have to choose between what's easy and what's right. And what's right isn't always what makes sense to other people. But how do you know what's right? It was a question that Carol had been asked many times over the years, by other women facing their own difficult choices, by government officials seeking to understand the motivations behind successful community building, by historians and journalists documenting the story of frontier settlement. You listen to your heart, she said simply, and you remember that the most important things in life are usually the things that are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible to win. As they walked back toward the house, Carol reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The scared young woman who had stepped off the train in Millbrook 10 years earlier could never have imagined the life she would eventually build, the challenges she would face, or the strength she would discover within herself. That woman had been seeking security and comfort, hoping to find a safe harbor in an uncertain world. What she had found instead was something far more valuable: the knowledge that she could face whatever challenges life presented, the skills to build something lasting and meaningful, and the relationships that would sustain her through whatever trials lay ahead. The frontier had tested her in ways she never could have anticipated, asking her to be stronger, more resourceful, more determined than she had ever imagined possible. But it had also offered her opportunities to discover who she really was and what she was truly capable of achieving. Most importantly, it had taught her that home was not something you found, but something you created through the choices you made and the stands you took when those choices were tested by circumstances beyond your control. It had shown her that true security came not from avoiding challenges, but from developing the strength and relationships necessary to meet them successfully. Years passed, and the story of Carol Stewart Lee became part of the folklore of the territory, told and retold by generations of settlers who drew inspiration from her example. The cornfield where her wheat had first survived was designated as a historical site, preserved as a reminder of the determination and courage that had built the frontier communities of the American West. Carol continued her work as an agricultural advisor and community organizer well into her later years, traveling throughout the expanding nation to share the lessons she had learned during those desperate months when survival had seemed impossible. Her techniques for drought-resistant farming were adopted by agricultural colleges and government agencies, helping farmers throughout the country better prepare for the challenges of unpredictable weather and economic uncertainty. The community that had formed around their struggle continued to thrive and grow, becoming a regional center for agriculture, education, and commerce. The values that had sustained them through their darkest hours became the foundation for institutions and traditions that would endure for generations. As Carol entered her final years, she often returned to the cornfield where her wheat had first survived, now accompanied by her grandchildren, who listened with wide-eyed wonder to the story of the grandmother who had refused to give up when everyone else said the cause was hopeless. The most important thing to remember, she would tell them, is that you are stronger than you know. Life will test you in ways you can't imagine, but if you remember who you are and what you're fighting for, you can survive anything. The wheat still grew in that field, tended now by her children and grandchildren who had learned the techniques she had developed during those desperate months of drought and uncertainty. The crop had become a symbol not just of agricultural success, but of the human capacity to endure and overcome even the most daunting challenges. On the 50th anniversary of her arrival in Millbrook, Carol stood once more in the field where her story had truly begun, surrounded by the community that had grown from the seeds of her determination. She was now an elderly woman, her hair white and her hands gnarled by decades of hard work, but her eyes still held the fire that had sustained her through her darkest hours. The celebration that year was attended by officials from the newly formed state government and by agricultural experts from universities throughout the country, and by ordinary farmers and settlers who had been touched by her example. But for Carol, the most meaningful moment came when a young woman approached her after the formal ceremonies had ended. "Mrs. Lee, the woman said, her voice trembling and with emotion, "I wanted to thank you. I'm facing foreclosure on my farm back in Kansas, and I was ready to give up until I heard your story. You've given me the courage to keep fighting." Carol took the young woman's hands in her own, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest labor and recognizing in her eyes the same mixture of fear and determination that she remembered from her own early days on the frontier. "What's your name, dear?" she asked gently. "Mary Patterson. I came out here with my husband 2 years ago, and we've been hit by drought and grasshopper plagues, and now the bank is threatening to take our land." Carol smiled, remembering her own younger self and the impossible challenges that had once seemed so overwhelming. "Mary," she said, "let me tell you something I learned a long time ago. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply decide that something is worth fighting for, and then fight for it with everything you have. But what if I fail? What if I lose everything anyway? Then at least you'll know you tried. At least you'll know you didn't give up without a fight." Carol's voice carried the wisdom of someone who had faced the same fears and emerged victorious. And who knows, you might just discover that you're stronger than you ever imagined. As the celebration wound down and the visitors began to depart, Carol remained in the field, looking out over the land that had tested her so severely and ultimately rewarded her faith. The wheat rustled gently in the evening breeze, its golden heads heavy with grain that would feed families throughout the region. Gregory joined her, as he had so many times over the years, his presence still a source of comfort and strength after all they had shared together. Their children and grandchildren played nearby, their laughter carrying across the fields that had been won through struggle and sustained through determination. "Any regrets?" Gregory asked, echoing a question they had posed to each other many times over the decades. Carol considered the question one final time, thinking about the paths not taken and the lives they might have lived if they had made different choices during those crucial months when their future hung in the balance. None, she said finally, her voice carrying the certainty that came from a life fully lived. Not one. As the sun set over the fields that had become her legacy, Carol Stewart Lee reflected on the journey that had brought her from a frightened mail-order bride to a respected leader and symbol of frontier resilience. She had come to Nebraska seeking security and comfort, but she had found something far more valuable: the knowledge that she could face whatever challenges life presented, the skills to build something lasting and meaningful, and the relationships that had sustained her through every trial. The mail-order bride who had refused to abandon her crop had become something she never expected to be. But in the end, she had become exactly who she was meant to be. And in the cornfield where her wheat still grew, the seeds of her courage continued to inspire new generations of dreamers and fighters who refused to give up on the promise of a better tomorrow. The wind carried the scent of growing grain across the prairie, a reminder that even in the harshest places, life finds a way to endure and thrive. And in that endurance, in that refusal to surrender to seemingly impossible odds, lay the true harvest of Carol Stewart Lee's extraordinary life.